Commander Jelvik stood on the bridge of the Imperial scout vessel Dawn's Edge and stared at the screens in front of him with growing confusion. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence as he tried to make sense of what the sensors were telling him. The yellow star ahead was ordinary enough and the system had been charted centuries ago, but something was very wrong with the data he was seeing now. The third planet from the star showed clear signs of advanced civilization, and that should have been impossible. According to every record in the Imperial database, this world had been marked as a quarantine zone over 500 years ago. The species that lived there had been dying from a plague so terrible that the Empire had forbidden all contact. The humans of Earth were supposed to be extinct or at best reduced to primitive survivors, scratching out a living in the ruins of their once great cities. But the sensors did not lie. There were orbital structures around the planet and power signatures that matched advanced technology, and electromagnetic communications flooding through space. Not only had the humans survived, but they had somehow rebuilt their entire civilization. Jelvik felt a chill run through his body despite the warm atmosphere of the bridge. How had they done it, and why had no one checked on them in all these years? He turned to his crew and began issuing orders. They needed to gather more information before reporting this to the Imperial Council, because if he was wrong about this, his career would be over before the day ended. The scanning continued for several hours, and with each passing minute, the evidence became more overwhelming. The humans had not just survived, but had thrived in ways that seemed impossible for a species that had lost so much. Their cities glowed with light across the night side of the planet, and their orbital infrastructure included defense platforms and communications arrays, and what looked like the beginnings of deep space vessels. Jelvik knew he had to report this immediately, but he also knew what questions would be asked. Why had the Empire abandoned them, and what would the Council do now that they knew humanity still existed? On Earth, Captain Jake Morrison sat in the command center of Orbital Defense Platform Liberty and watched the unknown vessel with growing concern. His instruments had detected it the moment it entered the outer system, and he had been tracking it ever since. The ship was enormous and far larger than anything humanity had ever built, and its hull seemed to shimmer with some kind of energy field that made accurate scans nearly impossible. Jake had been part of the defense network for 15 years, and he had trained for this moment his entire career, but now that it was actually happening, he felt his heart pounding in his chest, reached for the communications panel, and opened a priority channel to ground command. Within seconds, the face of General Patricia Hayes appeared on his screen, and her expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp with focus. Jake quickly briefed her on the situation and watched as she processed the information with the speed and efficiency that had made her one of the most respected military leaders on Earth. She asked a few quick questions and then told him to maintain observation and prepare all defensive systems, but not to take any aggressive action unless the unknown vessel made a hostile move. General Hayes ended the call and immediately contacted the World Council. Within 30 minutes, every major government on Earth knew that an alien vessel had entered their system, and the defense network was going to full alert status. Fighter squadrons launched from bases on Earth and the Moon, and all orbital platforms powered up their weapon systems. Humanity had spent 500 years preparing for this moment, and now that it had arrived, they were as ready as they could be. But ready for what exactly? Was this ship here to talk or to attack, and if it was here to talk, what would they say? In the fortified command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, General Hayes stood with her senior staff and studied the tactical displays. The alien ship had stopped its approach and was holding position just beyond the orbit of Mars. It was scanning them thoroughly, and they were scanning it right back. Colonel Danny Price stood beside her and reviewed the data coming in from their sensors. The ship was powerful, but it was alone, and that gave them some small comfort. If this was an invasion force, they would have sent more than one vessel. Lieutenant Commander Sophie Grant suggested that perhaps this was a scout ship or a diplomatic vessel, and Hayes agreed that seemed likely. The question now was what to do next. They could wait and see if the aliens made contact, or they could reach out first and establish that Earth was not some helpless world waiting to be claimed. Hayes made her decision quickly. They would send a message and make it clear that humanity was sovereign and strong, and not to be trifled with. She ordered the communications team to prepare a transmission and to make sure it was broadcast on every frequency they could manage. The message would be simple and direct and leave no room for misunderstanding. The transmission was sent and Hayes waited to see how the aliens would respond. The message had been clear enough. This was human space and the unknown vessel needed to state its intentions or leave immediately. It was a gamble because they had no idea what kind of species they were dealing with or what kind of weapons that massive ship carried, but Hayes believed that showing strength from the start was better than showing weakness. Humanity had learned hard lessons during the plague years, and one of those lessons was that the strong survived while the weak perished. Commander Jelvik received the transmission and felt his mandibles click together in surprise. The humans were not cowering or begging for mercy. They were making demands and threatening force if those demands were not met. It was bold and perhaps foolish given the vast difference in their capabilities, but it also spoke to a strength of spirit that Jelvik found himself respecting. He composed a response carefully and made sure his tone was diplomatic and peaceful. The Empire had protocols for first contact situations, and he would follow them to the letter. His message explained who he was and that the Empire had believed Earth to be dead and that they meant no harm and wished only to talk. The response from Earth came quickly, and again Jelvik was impressed by their efficiency. They were sending a diplomatic shuttle to his ship, and any movement toward their planet would be considered an act of war. Jelvik agreed to their terms and prepared to receive the human delegation. He was curious now about these survivors and wanted to understand how they had achieved what seemed impossible. The Empire had abandoned them to death and they had refused to die. That alone made them worthy of respect. The human shuttle was smaller than Jelvik had expected, but it moved through space with a grace that spoke of skilled engineering and careful design. He watched on his display screens as it approached the Dawn's Edge and maneuvered into position at the main docking port. His crew had prepared the reception area according to standard first contact protocols, and he had ordered his honor guard to present themselves in full ceremonial armor. The Empire valued tradition and ceremony, and he wanted to show these humans that they were being taken seriously. The airlock cycled through its sequence, and the indicator lights shifted from red to green, and the door opened, with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. 3 humans stepped through, and Jelvik got his first close look at the species that had defied extinction. The leader was a woman with gray hair cut short and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around her in a single glance. She wore a dark blue uniform with golden markings that Jelvik assumed indicated rank and authority, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced danger many times before. Behind her stood a younger man with red hair and pale skin, covered in small brown spots that Jelvik later learned were called freckles. The third human was older, with deeply lined skin and eyes that held the weight of years and experience. The woman stepped forward and spoke in clear, precise tones that the translation device rendered into Caltharian without difficulty. She introduced herself as Ambassador Lisa Carpenter and indicated that her companions were Dr. Henry Blake, who was their chief expert on alien life, and Commander Nick Torres, who represented their military forces. Jelvik bowed in the traditional manner of his people and welcomed them aboard his vessel. He apologized for the intrusion and explained again that the Empire had believed their world to be lifeless, and that no contact had been expected or planned. Lisa Carpenter looked at him with an expression that Jelvik could not quite read, but her next words were sharp and direct. She said that yes, they knew about the Empire's assumptions and they had received the quarantine broadcasts for the first 10 years after the plague began, but then the broadcasts had stopped and no one had ever checked to see if humanity had survived. The accusation in her voice was clear, and Jelvik felt a sensation that he had rarely experienced in his long career. He felt ashamed. The Empire had a duty to all living beings, and they had failed these humans by abandoning them without ever confirming their fate. Dr. Blake stepped forward, and his tone was softer than the ambassador's, but no less firm. He explained that humanity had survived because they had no other choice, and that the plague had killed billions of people and destroyed their infrastructure and their governments, but humans were stubborn creatures who refused to accept defeat. They had adapted and learned and rebuilt everything from the ground up. Jelvik listened carefully and found himself genuinely impressed by what he was hearing. Most species would have collapsed entirely under such circumstances, but these humans had not only survived but had somehow emerged stronger. Commander Nick Torres had remained silent throughout the initial exchange, but Jelvik noticed that the man's eyes never stopped moving and never stopped assessing every detail of the bridge and the crew. This was a warrior and one who took his duties seriously. Shelvik recognized the type because the Empire had many such warriors in its ranks, and they were the ones who kept the peace and protected the innocent. He respected Torres immediately, even though they had not yet exchanged a single word. Shelvik explained that he would need to report humanity's survival to the Imperial Council and that they would certainly want to establish formal diplomatic relations. Lisa Carpenter nodded and said that was exactly why they had come to his ship, but she wanted to make one thing absolutely clear. Humanity was not some primitive species begging to join the Empire, and they were not asking for charity or protection. They were a sovereign nation, and they expected to be treated as equals in any negotiations or agreements. Shelvik assured her that he understood and that he would convey her message to the Council exactly as she had stated it. The meeting continued for another 2 hours and covered many topics ranging from the technical details of human technology to the political structure of their world government. Shelvik learned that Earth had unified during the Plague Years, and that the old divisions between nations had been set aside in favor of cooperation and survival. The World Council now governed the entire planet and made decisions that affected all of humanity. It was an impressive achievement and one that many species in the Empire had never managed to accomplish. Most worlds remained divided into competing factions even after joining the Imperial Alliance. Dr. Blake shared some information about how humanity had defeated the plague, and Shelvik listened with growing fascination. The humans had used a combination of genetic engineering and targeted viral therapy and massive coordinated public health campaigns. It had taken decades and cost millions more lives, but eventually, they had developed immunity and eliminated the disease entirely. The doctor spoke with pride about the scientists and medical workers who had given everything to save their species, and Shelvik felt a deep respect for those who had made such sacrifices. When the meeting finally concluded, Ambassador Carpenter thanked Shelvik for his hospitality and said that Earth looked forward to hearing from the Imperial Council. She made it clear that humanity was willing to negotiate and cooperate, but that they would not compromise their sovereignty or their dignity. Shelvik assured her that the Empire had no interest in subjugating them, and that the Council would treat them with the respect they had earned through their survival. The 3 humans returned to their shuttle and departed back toward Earth, leaving Shelvik alone with his thoughts. Immediately began composing his report to the Imperial Council, and he knew that what he wrote would have consequences that reached far beyond this single star system. Humanity had survived the impossible, and they had done it without any help from the Empire or anyone else. They were strong and proud and determined, and they would not be easy to deal with in negotiations. But Shelvik believed that was a good thing because the Empire had grown complacent over the centuries, and perhaps these humans could remind them what it meant to struggle and overcome. He sent his report and then waited for orders, knowing that everything was about to change for both humanity and the Empire. The news of humanity's survival spread through the Imperial Council chambers like electricity through a circuit, and within hours every major species in the Empire knew that the supposedly dead humans of Earth were not only alive but thriving. Debates erupted in council halls across dozens of worlds as diplomats and politicians and military leaders argued about what this discovery meant and what should be done about it. Some saw opportunity while others saw potential danger, and everyone had an opinion about how the Empire should proceed. Empress Thaliara sat upon her crystalline throne in the heart of the imperial capital and listened to the reports and recommendations with the patience that came from having ruled for over 2,000 years. She had seen species rise and fall and had guided the empire through wars and plagues and political upheavals that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. Her advisors stood before her presenting their arguments, and each believed their position was the correct one, but Thaliara knew that this decision required wisdom beyond what any single advisor could provide. Counselor Fren, who specialized in diplomatic relations, argued passionately that humanity should be welcomed into the empire with open arms. He pointed out that any species capable of surviving what the humans had survived deserved respect and admiration. Their resilience and determination were qualities that the empire valued highly, and they could become valuable allies and trading partners. Vren believed that reaching out to humanity with friendship and support would strengthen the empire and create a bond that would last for generations. Security Chief Morlack saw things differently, and his concerns were darker and more cautious. He argued that a species which had survived extinction might be more aggressive and unpredictable than the empire was prepared to handle. They had been isolated for 5 centuries and had developed their technology and culture without any outside influence or guidance. What if their values did not align with imperial law? And what if they proved to be hostile or expansionist? Morlock wanted the Empire to proceed carefully and maintain strong defensive positions until humanity's true nature could be properly assessed. Other counselors offered their own perspectives, and the debates continued for days. Some worried about the precedent this would set for other quarantined worlds, and some questioned why the Empire had never checked on Earth after the initial quarantine was established. There were uncomfortable questions about imperial responsibility and whether they had failed in their duty by abandoning the humans without confirming their fate. Thaliara listened to everything and said very little, but her mind was working through possibilities and consequences with the speed and precision that had kept the Empire stable for millennia. Finally, after 3 days of debate, Thaliara raised one elegant hand and the entire chamber fell silent. She announced her decision in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast room. She would personally travel to Earth and meet with the human leaders face to face. This was too important to be handled through intermediaries, and she wanted to see for herself what kind of species humanity had become. Her advisors were shocked because the Empress rarely left the capital world, and when she did, it was always for matters of the gravest importance. But Thaliara was firm in her decision and ordered preparations to begin immediately. On Earth, the news that the Empress herself was coming caused both excitement and anxiety throughout the entire population. President Karen Foster called an emergency session of the World Council, and representatives from every nation gathered in the Great Assembly Hall in Geneva. The mood was tense because everyone understood that this meeting would determine humanity's place in the galaxy for centuries to come. They had to present a united front and show the Empire that humans were strong and capable and worthy of respect. General Hayes provided a detailed briefing on military readiness and made it clear that while Earth's defenses were prepared for any eventuality, they needed to be realistic about their capabilities. If the Empire wanted to destroy them, they probably could, but the fact that the Empress was coming in person suggested that violence was not their intention. This was a test, and humanity needed to pass it by, showing both strength and wisdom. The general recommended that they welcome the Empress with appropriate ceremony, but also make clear that Earth's sovereignty was not negotiable. Prime Minister Alan Carter, who led the European Union delegation, agreed with the general's assessment and added that humanity needed to show confidence without arrogance. They had survived the plague and rebuilt their civilization without any help, and that achievement spoke for itself. They should be proud of what they had accomplished, but also open to learning from species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. There was a balance to be struck between independence and cooperation. Dr. Claire Stevens, who was Earth's leading expert on xenobiology and galactic history, offered a perspective that gave many in the council pause. She suggested that while the Empire's abandonment of Earth had been cruel and painful, it might also have been the right decision in ways that were hard to accept. If the Empire had sent aid or evacuated people, the plague might have spread to other worlds and caused death on an unimaginable scale. The quarantine had been harsh, but it had contained the disease and perhaps saved billions of lives across the galaxy. It was a difficult truth, but one worth considering. The debate continued, but eventually consensus was reached. Humanity would welcome the Empress with dignity and respect, and would negotiate from a position of strength. They would not bow or beg, but they would also not be unnecessarily hostile or aggressive. President Foster was chosen to lead the human delegation along with Ambassador Lisa Carpenter and General Hayes and Dr. Stevens. Together, they would represent all of humanity in the most important diplomatic meeting in human history. When the Empress's vessel arrived in Earth orbit, it was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The ship looked like a massive crystal that pulsed with inner light and seemed to bend space around itself in ways that their sensors could barely measure. It took up position in high orbit and remained there for several hours, before a single shuttle detached and began its descent to the landing pad in Geneva. The entire world watched on screens as the shuttle landed with impossible grace and the main hatch opened to reveal the Empress and her honor guard. Empress Thaliara stepped out into Earth's atmosphere and took her first breath of air from the world that should have died but refused to. She was tall and graceful, with skin that seemed to shift between shades of blue and violet, and eyes that held the depth of ages. Her honor guard flanked her in perfect formation, wearing armor that gleamed like polished starlight, and President Foster walked forward to meet her with Ambassador Carpenter at her side. The two leaders faced each other, and the moment felt heavy with significance. President Foster spoke first and welcomed the Empress to Earth with words that were formal but warm. Thaliara responded in kind and said that she had come to offer the apologies of an empire and to witness what she called a miracle of survival and determination. Together they walked into the assembly hall where the leaders of humanity waited, and the meeting that would shape the future of both civilizations began. The negotiations stretched across 3 long days and filled the great assembly hall, with voices speaking in multiple languages and expressing ideas that bridged the gap between 2 very different civilizations. The Empress sat at the center of the chamber, surrounded by her advisors, while the leaders of humanity faced her from across the polished table, and between them lay the future of Earth and its place among the stars. Thaliara spoke less than her advisors, but when she did speak, everyone listened, because her words carried the weight of millennia and the wisdom of a ruler who had seen empires rise and fall. Dr. Claire Stevens was asked to explain how humanity had survived the plague, and she did so, with a calm voice that barely hinted at the horror those years had contained. She told the Empress that 8 billion people had died in just the first year, and that governments had collapsed and infrastructure had failed, and for a time it seemed certain that extinction was humanity's fate. Cities had become graveyards, and the few survivors had struggled to find food and clean water and safety, from both the disease and the chaos that came with societal breakdown. Yet somehow, in the midst of all that death and destruction, humans had found the will to keep fighting. Ambassador Lisa Carpenter continued the story and explained that survival had come down to community and cooperation on a scale never before seen in human history. Scientists from every nation had shared their research freely and worked together to understand the plague's mechanisms. Doctors and nurses had risked and often lost their lives caring for the sick, even when they knew they might become infected themselves. Engineers had kept power plants running and water treatment facilities operating even as their co-workers died around them. Farmers had continued to plant and harvest crops to feed the survivors, and ordinary people by the millions had simply refused to give up hope, even when hope seemed foolish. Commander Nick Torres added the military perspective and explained that once the plague had finally burned itself out after taking so many lives, the survivors realized they were completely alone. They had received the Empire's quarantine broadcast for 10 years, and then those broadcasts had stopped and no one came to check on them, or offer help, or even confirm whether anyone still lived. So humanity had learned to depend only on themselves, and they had built defenses and developed new technologies and prepared for a universe that might be hostile or indifferent to their existence. It was not done out of aggression, but out of the simple need to protect what they had rebuilt. The Empress listened carefully to everything, and her ancient eyes seemed to see into the souls of those speaking. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking, and when she did, her voice held something that sounded like regret. She acknowledged that the Empire had failed humanity by abandoning them without ever confirming their fate, and that this failure would be recorded in Imperial history as a lesson for future generations. But she also pointed out that the quarantine had been established to prevent the plague from spreading to other worlds, and that at the time, the decision had seemed both necessary and merciful. Still, the fact remained that no one had checked, and that was inexcusable. On the 3rd day of negotiations, the Empress made her formal proposal, and the entire chamber grew silent as she spoke. She said that the Caltharian Empire wished to extend an offer of alliance to humanity, but not as subjects or vassals. This would be a partnership between equals where Earth retained complete sovereignty over its territory and population and government. In exchange for joining the Imperial Alliance, humanity would gain access to advanced technologies and trade networks and mutual defense agreements. They would have a voice in Imperial councils, and their representatives would be heard and respected. President Foster asked the obvious question about what the Empire would gain from such an arrangement, and the Empress's answer surprised many in the room. She said that humanity's perspective was what the Empire needed most because they had survived what should have been impossible, and in doing so had developed innovations and approaches to problems that no other species had considered. The Empire had grown comfortable and perhaps complacent over the centuries, and humanity's experience with struggle and adaptation could help remind them what it meant to overcome adversity. Plus, their unique solutions to technological and social problems could benefit all member species. The World Council requested time to deliberate. and the Empress granted them privacy to discuss the offer among themselves. The debate that followed was intense because this decision would affect every human alive and all those yet to be born. Some counselors were skeptical and worried that this was a trap, or that the Empire would eventually try to control them despite promises of sovereignty. Others saw the incredible opportunities that alliance would bring, including technologies that could solve problems humanity had struggled with for centuries and access to resources beyond anything Earth could provide. Alone, General Hayes spoke frankly about the military realities and pointed out that Earth could not remain isolated forever. Their solar system was large but finite, and eventually they would need to expand, and that expansion would bring them into contact with other species, whether they wanted it or not. Better to have allies and friends when that happened, rather than facing the galaxy alone and unprepared. The alliance would give them protection and support, while they grew strong enough to truly defend themselves. On a galactic scale, Dr. Henry Blake emphasized the scientific benefits and painted a picture of medical advances that could eliminate diseases and extend human lifespans and solve problems that currently seemed impossible. The Empire's knowledge of physics and engineering and biology could accelerate Earth's development by centuries and save millions of lives through improved technology and better understanding of the universe. It was an opportunity that might never come again, and refusing it out of fear seemed short-sighted. But it was Counselor Amy Rogers, a young representative from the Australian territories, who spoke the words that ultimately swayed the vote. She stood and addressed the council with passion and clarity beyond her years. She reminded everyone that 500 years ago the Empire had left humanity alone to either die or survive on their own terms, and that isolation had been terrible and costly, but it had also allowed humans to develop their own identity and strength. Now the Empire was offering them a place at the table, as equals, not as inferiors, and that offer said something important about how they were viewed. Humanity had earned respect through survival, and they should accept the alliance while keeping their eyes open and their defenses ready. The vote was called, and when the count was finished, the decision was unanimous. Every nation and every representative agreed that humanity should accept the Empire's offer of alliance. President Foster returned to the Assembly Hall and informed the Empress of their decision, and Thaliara rose from her seat and bowed deeply in the manner that her people reserved for moments of great significance. She said that this was the beginning of something important, and that both civilizations would grow stronger together than either could alone. The formal documents would be prepared, and a signing ceremony would be scheduled, and a new chapter in human history would begin. The formal signing ceremony took place in orbit aboard a space station that had been constructed specifically for this historic occasion by teams of human and Caltharian engineers working side by side. The station was named Unity, and it represented everything that the Alliance stood for, with its elegant design incorporating elements from both civilizations in perfect harmony. Dignitaries from across the Empire had traveled to witness this moment, and the station's observation decks were filled with beings of dozens of different species, all gathered to see humanity officially join the galactic community. Ambassador Lisa Carpenter wore her formal diplomatic uniform and carried herself with the same quiet confidence that had impressed Commander Jelvik during their first meeting. She held the signing instrument in her hand and paused for just a moment to look out at Earth, hanging in space below them, before placing her signature on the treaty document. Her hand was steady, and her expression was calm, but inside she felt the weight of 500 years of isolation and struggle and survival finally coming to an end. Humanity was no longer alone and would never be alone again. Empress Thaliara signed next, and her ancient hand moved across the document with practiced grace, and as she finished the last stroke, she looked up at Lisa and smiled in a way that transcended species and language. The two of them stood together before the assembled witnesses, and the Empress spoke words that would be remembered for generations. She said that today marked not just an alliance between civilizations, but a recognition that strength comes in many forms, and that humanity's refusal to accept defeat had earned them a place of honor among the stars. Their story would be told across the Empire as inspiration to all who faced impossible odds. President Foster spoke next and addressed both the humans watching from Earth and the countless beings across the Empire who were witnessing this ceremony. She said that for 5 centuries humanity had wondered if they were truly alone in the universe, and today they knew with certainty that they were part of something far larger than themselves. But joining the galactic community did not mean losing their identity or forgetting where they came from. They would carry forward the memory of the 8 billion who had died during the plague and build a future that honored their sacrifice. They would remain human in all the ways that mattered while reaching toward the stars with hope and determination. In the months that followed, everything began to change in ways both large and small. Human scientists found themselves working alongside Imperial researchers in laboratories that spanned multiple worlds, and the collaboration produced breakthroughs in medicine and energy production and materials science that neither group could have achieved alone. The humans brought their unique perspective shaped by necessity and hardship, while the Imperial scientists contributed knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. Together, they solved problems that had stumped both civilizations for decades. Human ships that had been designed for exploration within their own solar system were retrofitted with Imperial drive systems, and suddenly the galaxy opened up before them. Captain Jake Morrison, who had been the first to spot the Dawn's Edge, now commanded a vessel called the Pathfinder and led exploration missions to nearby star systems. His crew was mixed with both humans and various Imperial species learning to work together, despite differences in biology and culture and communication. It was not always easy, but they made it work through patience and mutual respect. Trade routes were established between Earth and other worlds in the Empire, and goods began flowing in both directions. Humanity discovered markets for their unique technologies and cultural products, while gaining access to resources and materials that were rare or non-existent in their own system. The economic benefits were substantial, but perhaps more important were the cultural exchanges as humans learned about alien civilizations and those civilizations learned about humanity in return. Music and art and literature crossed the void between stars and enriched both sides. Commander Nick Torres accepted an appointment as humanity's first liaison to the Imperial Defense Fleet and found himself working with military leaders from dozens of species. They were eager to learn about human tactical innovations, especially the guerrilla warfare techniques and adaptive defense strategies that humanity had developed during their isolation. Torres discovered that while the Empire had vastly superior technology, they had grown somewhat predictable in their military thinking, and the fresh perspectives he brought were valued highly. He also learned much from them about large-scale fleet operations and coordinated defense across multiple systems. Dr. Henry Blake and Dr. Claire Stevens led the Xenobiological Exchange Program and introduced humanity to the incredible diversity of life in the galaxy. They cataloged species that breathed methane, and species that lived in molten rock, and species whose biology was so different from anything on Earth that understanding them required completely new scientific frameworks. Every discovery opened new questions and new possibilities, and the two doctors worked tirelessly to ensure that human scientists could contribute meaningfully to the expanding body of galactic knowledge. But not everything was smooth or easy, because whenever different cultures come together, there are bound to be misunderstandings and conflicts. Some humans found it difficult to trust the Empire after centuries of isolation and abandonment, and some Imperial species looked down on humanity as newcomers who had not yet proven themselves worthy of their place in the Alliance. There were incidents and arguments and moments when the partnership seemed fragile and uncertain, yet both sides worked through these difficulties because they recognized that what they were building together was worth the effort. Trade disputes were resolved through negotiation, and cultural misunderstandings were addressed through education and dialogue. When a human colony ship accidentally violated Imperial space regulations near a protected world, the matter was handled through diplomatic channels rather than military action. When an Imperial merchant tried to exploit Earth's relatively inexperienced traders, the Empire's own justice system intervened and made restitution. Slowly but surely, the alliance grew stronger, as both sides learned to work together and respect each other's differences. 1 year after first contact, Ambassador Lisa Carpenter stood once again on the observation deck of Unity Station and looked down at Earth turning peacefully below. Commander Jelvik joined her as he often did during his visits to the station, and the two of them had become friends over the months of working together. He asked her if she regretted how things had happened and whether she wished the Empire had intervened during the plague years instead of leaving humanity to face it alone. Lisa was quiet for a long moment as she considered the question. She finally said that she regretted the suffering and the billions who had died, and the pain that survivors had endured. But she also recognized that the isolation had forced humanity to become strong in ways they might never have achieved if someone had rescued them. They had learned self-reliance and developed technologies and social structures that were uniquely their own. Now they came to the galactic community, not as dependents, but as partners with something valuable to contribute. Perhaps things had happened the way they needed to happen, even if that was a difficult truth to accept. Shelvik said that he had learned something important from humanity and from Lisa in particular. He had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from avoiding hardship, but from enduring it and emerging changed, but unbroken on the other side. The Empire had protected its member species for so long that many had grown soft and forgotten what it meant to truly struggle for survival. Humanity could teach them to remember, and in doing so make the entire Empire stronger. Lisa smiled at that and said she hoped he was right. Below them, Earth continued its eternal rotation and cities sparkled with light across the continents. Ships moved between the planet and the orbital stations carrying people and goods and ideas in endless circulation. In schools and universities, young humans learned alongside young beings from across the Empire, and friendships formed that crossed the boundaries of species. The future was uncertain, as all futures are, but it was also bright with possibility and hope. The story of humanity's survival had become legend across the Empire, and was told on worlds humanity had never heard of. It was the story of a species that looked at extinction and refused to accept it, and of people who came together in their darkest hour and saved themselves through courage and cooperation and stubborn determination. It was a reminder that the impossible was only impossible until someone achieved it, and that strength came in many forms. And now humanity had taken its place among the stars not as victims or refugees, but as equals who had earned their seat at the table through trials that would have destroyed lesser species. The adventure was just beginning, and the galaxy would never be the same.